Good morning. This is Ron. It is Saturday, April the 7th. Welcome to Story Time. And today I pick up with chapter 13. It may be part 3. I'll have to check. Stimulus and Response, chapter 13 of Ayn Rand's book, Philosophy, Who Needs It? And it's a chapter that is basically a review of B.F. Skinner, Dr. B.F. Skinner's book called Beyond Freedom and Dignity. Inexorably, like all mystics, Mr. Skinner reverts to a mystic dualism, to an equivalent of the mind-body split, which becomes a body-bodies split. In Mr. Skinner's version, it is not a conflict between God and the devil, but between man's two conditioners, social environment and genetic endowment. The conflict takes place inside man's skin in the form of two selves. A self is a repertoire of behavior appropriate to a given set of contingencies. The conflict, therefore, is between two repertoires. The controlling self, the conscience or superego, is a social organ, but the controlled self is more likely to be the product of genetic susceptibilities to reinforcement, the id or the old Adam. The controlling self generally represents the interests of others, the controlled self the interests of the individual. Page 199. Where have we heard this before, and for how many pre-scientific millennia? Mr. Skinner's voice is loud and clear when he declares, quote, "To be for oneself is to be almost nothing," unquote. Page 123. As proof, he revives another ancient saw. The capacity of the human species to transmit knowledge deprives man of any claim to individuality or to individual achievement because he has to start by learning from others. Quote, "The great individualists so often cited to show the value of personal freedom have owed their successes to earlier social environments. The involuntary individualisms of a Robinson Crusoe and the voluntary individualism of a Henry David Thoreau show obvious debts to society. If Crusoe had reached the island as a baby, and if Thoreau had grown up unattended on the shores of Walden Pond, their stories would have been different. We must all begin as babies, and no degree of self-determination, self-sufficiency, or self-reliance will make us individuals in any sense beyond that of single members of the human species," unquote. Pages 123 to 124. This means we are all begin as babies and remain in that state. Since a baby is not self-sufficient, neither is an adult. Nothing has happened in between. Observe also the same method of setting up a straw man that was used in regard to volition, setting it up outside of reality. E.g., in order to be an individual, Thomas A. Edison would have had to appear in the jungle by parthenogenesis as an infant without human parents, then rediscover all by himself the entire course of the science of physics from the first fire to the electric light bulb. Since no one has done this, there's no such thing as individualism. From a foundation of this kind, Mr. Skinner proceeds to seek, quote, "justice or fairness," unquote, or a, quote, "reasonable balance," unquote, in the, quote, "exchange between the individual and his social environment," unquote, page 124. But he announces such questions, quote, "cannot be answered simply by pointing to what is personally good or what is good for others. There is another kind of value to which we must now turn," unquote. Page 125. Now we come to the payoff. A mystic code of morality demanding self-sacrifice cannot be promulgated or propagated without a supreme ruler that becomes the collector of the sacrificing. Traditionally, there have been two such collectors, either God or society. The collector had to be inaccessible to mankind at large, and his authority had to be revealed only through an elite of special intermediaries, variously called high priests, commissars, gauleiters, etc. Mr. Skinner follows the same pattern, but here he has a new collector and supreme ruler to hoist, the culture. A culture, he explains, is, quote, "the customs, the customary behaviors of people," unquote, page 127. Quote, "A culture, like a species, is selected by its adaptation to an environment. To the extent that it helps its members to get what they need and avoid what is dangerous, it helps them to survive and transmit the culture. The two kinds of evolution are closely interwoven. The same people transmit both a culture and a genetic endowment. though in very different ways and for different parts of their lives, unquote. Quote, a culture is not the product of a creative group mind or the expression of a general will. A culture evolves when new practices further the survival of those who practice them, unquote. Pages 133 to 134. Thus, we owe our survival to the culture. Therefore, Mr. Skinner announces, to the two values discussed, personal good and the good of others, we must now, quote, add a third, the good of the culture, unquote. Page 134. What is the good of the culture? Survival. Whose survival? Its own. A culture is an end in itself. Quote, when it has become clear that a culture may survive or perish, some of its members may begin to act to promote its survival, unquote. Which members? By what means are they able to grasp such a goal? No answer. Mr. Skinner stresses repeatedly that the survival of culture is a value different from and superior to the survival of its members, of oneself or of others, a value one ought to live and die for. Why? Mr. Skinner is suddenly explicit. Quote, none of this will explain what we might call a pure concern for the survival of culture, but we do not really need an explanation. The simple fact is that a culture which for any reason induces its members to work for survival or for the survival of some of its practices is more likely to survive. Survival is the only value according to which a culture is eventually to be judged, and any practice that furthers survival has survival value by definition, unquote. Page 136. Whose survival? No answer. Mr. Skinner lets it ride on an equivocation of this kind. If survival, quote, is the only value according to which a culture is eventually to be judged, unquote, then the Nazi culture, which lasted 12 years, had a certain degree of value. The Soviet culture, which lasted 55 years, has a slightly higher value. The feudal culture of the Middle Ages, which lasted 5 centuries, had a still higher value. But the highest value of all must be ascribed to the culture of ancient Egypt, which, with no variations or motion of any kind, lasted unchanged for 30 centuries. A, quote, culture, unquote, in Mr. Skinner's own terms, is not a thing, not an idea, not even people, but a collection of practices, a behavior, a disembodied behavior that supersedes those who behave, i.e., a way of acting to which the actors must be sacrificed. This is mysticism of a kind that makes God or society seem sensibly realistic, rulers by comparison. It is also conservatism of a metaphysical kind that makes political conservatism seem innocuously childish. It demands that we live, work, and die, not for ourselves or for others, but for the sake of preserving and transmitting to yet unborn generations, and in perpetuity, the very way we dress, the way we ride the subway, the way we get drunk, the way we deal with baseball or religion or economics, etc. Thus, Mr. Skinner, the arch-materialist, ends up as a worshipper of disembodied motion, and the arch-revolutionary as a guardian of the status quo, any status quo. In order to be induced to the sacrifice of the good for the culture, the victims are promised deferred advantages. But what is its, quote, an economic system's answer to the question, why should I be concerned about the survival of a particular kind of economic system? The only honest answer to that kind of question seems to be this. There is no good reason why you should be concerned, but if your culture has not convinced you that there is, so much the worse for your culture. This means, in order to survive, a culture must convince its members that there is good reason to be concerned with its survival, even though there is none. This is social Darwinism of a kind that Herbert Spencer would not dream of. The nearest approach to an exponent in practice was Adolf Hitler, who reinforced his followers by demanding sacrifices for the survival of the German culture. But Mr. Skinner envisions a grander scale. He advocates, quote, a single culture for all mankind, unquote, which he admits is difficult to explain to the sacrificial victims. Quote, we can nevertheless point to many reasons why people should now be concerned for the good of all mankind. The great problems of the world today are all global, but pointing to consequences is not enough. We, who, must arrange contingencies under which consequences will have an effect, unquote. Pages 137 to 138. this, quote, arranger of contingencies, unquote, is to be a single totalitarian world state, serving the survival of a single culture, ruling every cell of every man's brain and every moment of his life. What are the great problems this state would solve? What are the terrifying possibilities from which we must be saved at the price of giving up our freedom, dignity, reason, mind, values, self-esteem? Mr. Skinner answers, quote, overpopulation, the depletion of resources, the pollution of the environment, and the possibility of a nuclear holocaust. These are the not-so-remote consequences of present courses of action. Unquote, page 138. If lightning struck Mount Sinai and Moses appeared on the mountaintop carrying sacred tablets and silenced the lost, frightened, desperate throng below in order to read a revelation of divine wisdom, and read a third-rate editorial from a random tabloid, the dramatic, intellectual, and moral effect would be similar, except that Moses was less pretentious. Mr. Skinner's book falls to pieces in its final chapters. The author's verbal behavior becomes so erratic that he sounds as if he's lost all interest in his subject. Tangled in contradictions, equivocations, and non sequiturs, he seems to stumble wearily in circles, seizing any rationalization at random, not to defend his thesis, but to attack his critics, throwing feeble little jabs, projecting an odd kind of stale, lethargic, perfunctory malice, almost a reflex malice. He sounds like a man filling empty pages with something, anything, in order to circumvent the accumulated weight of unanswered questions, or like a man who resents being questioned. And that's the part 3 of Philosophy Who Needs It, chapter 13, The Stimulus and the Response. One of the things I wanted to note about this particular section, as I was reading it, it occurred to me that what basically Dr. Skinner is talking about is, in terms of in practical terms, is impossible. There's no way that people can or will give themselves over or sacrifice themselves to the culture. Rarely, as a matter of fact, do they give themselves over, sacrifice themselves to anything or anybody. They may pretend to do so. And that's so much of what the left is all about. Conceit, pretending to do this, pretending to do that, pretending to be concerned about your fellow man when really all you want to do is act like a bully, push people around, boss people around. And in this particular case, again, it would be pretending because nobody can pull this off. Nobody is going to be able to, as she is describing, he can't even keep up with his own, he can't keep everything straight. All the crap he can't keep straight in his mind long enough to finish the book. How does he or anyone else expect anybody to actually live and function in a society as that he describes, in which everybody is sacrificed to the culture? It won't happen. A lot of people might pretend to do it, but they won't actually do it. They will. It's like in communism. There's a saying. There was a saying in the Soviet Union by the workers, and they say, "We pretend to work; they pretend to pay us." And that's basically what it was. The people's paradise, but it's all just pretending. And there's no end to the pretending, because what they're looking for cannot be brought to bear, cannot be created in reality. So, anyways, tomorrow I will continue with part 4 of this chapter. And until then, thank you very much for joining me, and have a great day.